Welcome back to Next Level Rides. In today's episode, we're continuing on the Mazda project here. I don't know if it has a name yet. We'll call it the FC3S project. Good enough. Anyways, stay tuned. We'll get at it. So a few things I did off camera, or did on camera, I'm not sure, is I finished up the fuel system here. So right down here, I ended up building a bit of a bracket so that I could end up using the factory lines, well, not the factory lines, but the lines that were in there prior. So the nice stainless lines from, I think they're Aeroquip, or with Earl's fittings. So mounted that here where it's nice and out of the way, and then we have the stainless lines going up and around. So the one line goes from the fuel filter here up and over to the primary fuel rail that has the factory 550 injectors. Now, those ones there, I ended up having flow tested clean just to ensure that they end up flowing properly. And from here, there's a stainless line that goes up to this secondary rail here. Now these use 1680 cc secondary injectors. These ones here are off of, I believe it's a Crown Victoria that runs off natural gas. So they were only about $35 each. The ones that I had taken in to get flow tested, they were bad. They were seized up and had a bunch of issues. From there, I ended up doing just a quick 90 and a 45 here to get it out and away from the intake manifold that sits up top and the linkage at the back, all the way over here to the regulator, from the out on the regulator, back to the port for the fuel tank. Other than that, I pulled all the wiring out of here from the MSD box. So I pulled it all here, labeled it all, which went to, let's see if it makes sense. So positive on the battery, negative on the battery. Now, could I have figured it out? Yeah, I'm sure I could have, but I wanted to make it foolproof. What does this one say? Had no connection. Okay, perfect. So the leading coil here, this is just kind of sitting here on the 10 mil bolt. So this all here looked like it had been run over with a cheese grater, so it looked pretty jank. So I wanted to clean it all up, give it a spray of color, and then now I'm gonna re-put everything here nice and proper, clean up the wiring. The biggest thing is right down here. So right here is where the intercooler pipe goes. So it kind of goes up and across here, over top here, and then it goes directly down into that little hole that looks like it was cut with a chainsaw, but that's okay. I'll clean this all up so you can see if it's all tidied up and out of the way, there's lots of room. So that's all nice and clean. I'll tidy that and then move on to this side. So as you can see, if you were to compare it, nice, looks great, looks like so over here, there's a bunch of scratches and stuff. So same thing, I'm gonna clean it all up, wipe it down, give it a spray, and should be good to go. So a few things I wanna show you that I did off camera way before I even decided to start a YouTube channel was on the inside. All right, so first things first, here's the intake manifold that was all cleaned up. It was, if it's gonna show you, no, let me get a flashlight. So secondary butterflies were removed and it was knife edged. So looks really good, it flowed really well. But other than that, I just tidied up the linkage here just because I didn't need all that cruise control and garbage. And just inside the ports, just in behind the throttle body here and for the intake manifold to the lower portion, these were gasket matched. So it's all nice ported. I am gonna stick with this one because I'm using the Power FC, so that's not gonna be a big deal. Other than that, cleaned up the intercooler, just gave it a quick spritz of black enamel. It's gonna end up looking pretty good. Now the damage down there, it took a bar off the highway when it was brand new, but it doesn't leak or anything, so we should be good to go. Somehow managed to find a good shift boot. There's gonna be a bunch of other stuff here. Nothing worth really noting. So these we're gonna need today. So those are all cleaned up. I thought they were black, turns out they're silver. And this is all just factory stuff. Now here, so this is the factory engine harness. Now, because I have those big secondary injectors and they're either high or low impedance, they needed to have resistors wired in. So these were wired in, but over the years, the wires became very brittle and crispy. I don't know if you can see that connector. It's not in the nicest of shape. So I have new connectors that I'm gonna end up crimping on or soldering on. And then I have the copper, what do they call it? The copper conductive tape for the inner portion where it goes inside the vehicle. So I believe it's that side there. So it ends up having a ground to the conductive tape and self-fusing silicone tape, fabric tape, and all that other stuff. So long story short, I took all the emissions wiring off. The harness is actually half the size it normally would be. So I gotta finish that up and then run it in and through, and we should be good to go. Now, a couple things that are worth noting. These were all smashed. This one was smashed, so I got both of these from Mazda, ironically enough. They weren't cheap, but hey, they still had them, so why not? I put a double din in there where the original gauges were, so took the gauges out. It was kind of a half-ass install, so I didn't want to deal with it. Again, you'll see the transmission portion where I ended up rebuilding the shifter, so that's all taken care of. Ignore the car cover, that's from the 5 Series. Right over here, the shifting surround or the gauge cluster surround, whatever we want to call that. So this was all up and broken. Now, a bit of a tip for this, because it's very fragile plastic. So what I did for that is I ended up putting it on the bench, and because where the screw would thread in, half of it was broken, or the backside was broken because it was brittle, and maybe I got frustrated at one point and may have hit it. Anyways, you take a screw that fits the thread, you put Vaseline on it, you sit it right into the threads, and then you pour epoxy over top of it. So once the epoxy cures, it's now made a bit of a form. So you could easily, because the screw is Vaseline or has Vaseline on it, you can unscrew the screw, and then you have actually a working threaded port so that you could end up connecting it. So this is nice and solid. I'll see if I can sneak in on the other side. All right, so there we are. It's all nice and solid. Like, this used to fall off every time I would use it, but it works really good here. No more play in the steering wheel, which is nice. I have a Profect B Spec 2 that I'm gonna retain. So that's gonna double as the boost controller and the boost gauge, I guess. Now, the wideband was originally here, so there's a crack just because it's very brittle plastic and I didn't want to screw around with that, let alone this is a few $100. So I put a little figure there, that'll be fine for now. Now, the nice thing is the wideband that used to be over here, I put over here. So this was the only vent that was actually okay. So I took a piece of ABS, so I trimmed it out, I hand filed it, and then epoxied 2 pieces together so that it was a little bit thicker and had a little bit of rigidity to it. So for here, I ended up drilling a hole through, mounted that, and then the wiring goes down here that I'll have to deal with at a later date with the turbo timer. So that's not a big deal, but this is much cleaner and it ends up looking really good. I didn't want a big pod pillar just because it's the 1 gauge, so worked out good. Same thing, got one of these vents from Mazda and my Infinity Kappa stereo from way back when. So I'll have to rewire it, but it should be good to go. Other than that, for today, we have the drive shaft to put in with the heat shields on the other side. We're gonna put the oil tube back in so that I can mock up the intercooler piping. Ignore the transmission mounts, those are just old and potentially from a BMW. Old steering shaft, but we're gonna use the oil cooler lines. So what I'm gonna need to do is I'm gonna have to put a seal or a new crush washer, I guess, on the bottom of the factory oil cooler, just because it's been leaking for some time now and it leaves a mess everywhere. So I'm gonna change that. I bought one at Mazda, it's kind of whatever, but we have a bunch of parts here, more parts there, and more parts there. There's still a lot of stuff to do, but I don't know if it's gonna be all that bad. I'm gonna set the camera down, I'm gonna fight with everything underneath, tighten up the downpipe, and ideally I wanna get this off the quick jack so that I could slide it out of the way and then start with everything from the engine bay. So the first thing I start with is aligning the downpipe. It was a bit of a pain because it wasn't actually lining up properly, and I always had an exhaust leak right at the bottom. So to ensure that it was working properly and it was going to be lined up, it was a little bit of testing, tuning, and tweaking. It got a little bit close to the transmission, but I think it'll be perfectly fine with the amount of clearance that's in between. Next up, I'm replacing the seal for the oil cooler thermostat. So this oil cooler, not only is it large for an RX-7 and for most vehicles themselves, it actually has a specific grommet to keep it from leaking oil. Mine's been leaking for quite some time now, so of course I went to Mazda, ordered the appropriate part, and ended up changing it. Now you got to be a little bit careful when you take this one out because there's a spring with a mechanism on the end. So get it all back, put a bit of tension, start threading it by hand, and then I believe I ended up using a pipe wrench. So regarding the oil cooler lines, I had already known exactly which way they had gone, so the longer one going to the back housing or near the rear of the motor, and then the shorter one going towards the front. I did have a picture that I took prior, just to ensure that I had them appropriate and in the right place. This is pretty straightforward. I didn't end up having an AN wrench, so I just ended up using a pipe wrench. So the front oil cooler line was much easier to do from up above. So because it's right on the front here, I just made sure that when I took all the tape off that there was no residue for it to leak or for any reason for it to leak. And then installing the front oil cooler line was pretty simple. There's a specific orientation since this one is a little bit longer than it really needed to be, but pretty simple, straightforward stuff. It's -10 AN. We get it all bolted up, made sure there's no tension, and then eventually zip tied the two together so that they wouldn't rub, chafe, or cause any issue. So since I had the downpipe oriented properly, I didn't have to worry about it when I put the drive shaft back in. So the drive shaft is pretty simple. It slips right into the back output shaft of the transmission, and then it's just the 4 bolts that connect it to the rear differential. After the drive shaft itself, we ended up starting by putting back the heat shields, which are pretty straightforward. They're just a bunch of 10mm hex bolts, and afterwards we end up putting the rest of the exhaust back. It took a little bit of finessing to put the exhaust back on. I just wanted to ensure that from the downpipe to the rest of the exhaust there wasn't going to be a leak like it always have had. So it ended up bolting up pretty good. I used a 3-inch gasket with a little bit of gasket maker on either side. It's definitely not going to leak now. I gave you a bit of a glimpse as to what we were working with. So new connectors, I believe these are for the fuel injectors. That's good. Question mark. 5 injector. Maybe secondary injector. Now, a few things that we definitely will need for this is self-fusing silicone tape to protect the harness itself. Hopefully it doesn't make it too rigid. This is going to be a MAF sensor connector for an FD because I have the FD MAF sensor. Along with that, harness wiring tape. So this is that nice fabric tape. And for the bottom of the harness here, let's see if I can show you, where it goes inside the vehicle. So you'll see here, there's a little bit of conductive tape or copper foil tape. So what you need to do is, because I ended up cutting this and took the foil off it initially, I'm gonna wrap it with this foil tape. Now, I'd imagine what this ends up doing is it keeps it from inducting or causing signal concerns or issues. So I'm gonna put this underneath, wrap it, and I'm gonna ensure that I wrap the entire thing so that it's protected. So this here, I trace this ground wire to there's a branch of grounds right here, right there. So it actually goes right to the computer and it grounds the computer. So it's an additional ground for the harness. Maybe it's for static, but either way, we're gonna keep it the same. Good old 3M Temflex electrical tape. You want good electrical tape that's not gonna start to unwind. And gloves, strippers, and so forth. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put this on the ground. I'm gonna pull the harness and put it right over top here to show you what I've done thus far. Okay, so the harness itself, I started to wrap here just to keep all the wiring together. Now, this harness ended up being, I think it's half the thickness that it used to be, because I ended up putting tape and X's on the connectors that were useless or not required. So I've de-pinned those right on this harness here. There's a bunch of open holes. So everything else is good. What I'm gonna start with is changing the connectors and hopefully remember where each one of these goes. So because these are a little bit oily and a little bit dirty, I'm gonna use connector cleaner on each one of these that I don't change, just to make sure I have a good connector. And a lot of you that end up running secondary injectors, because there's a difference in impedance, you need to solder in or butt connect resistors. So this one here is a 3 ohm resistor. Now, I can't remember if it's high or low impedance, but essentially what it does is it changes it from high to low or low to high. So I'm not completely sure. But of course, the connector itself, actually, you know what? Doesn't look terrible. I might not need to change these ones. No, you know what? Secondary injectors look good. So what I'll do is I'll just wrap it and we'll be done. All right, so I decided to end up changing the connectors anyways. It just made sense. So as you can see, resistor still intact. I ended up soldering it just a little bit so it shouldn't have a resistor issue. It's strengthened either side, nice new connector. This one actually has a quick disconnect that I Might have just broke. All right, great. And then for the other injectors, these ones here. So these are all nice, fresh, good connections. There's another one and the last one. So these will end up ensuring that I have a proper connection with the injectors. I'm gonna try and find what this one is to replace it. But in the meantime, I'm gonna start with wrapping this and go from there. So here I'm using conductive tape, or I guess you could call it copper foil tape. Now the factory harness that's inside the vehicle itself, under the dash and behind the carpet, it had this factory. So you'll end up seeing, if you end up working on one of these, that there ended up being a bit of a wire, which is essentially a ground, soldered to the end of the tape or the foil, just to ensure there's no static or interference that would induct into the wiring itself. All right, now that that's all done, I'll give you a bit of a rundown. So this is the little grommet that goes into the firewall. Now, this is all wrapped initially with that copper insulation tape, or whatever we're gonna call it. So the whole thing's wrapped in this flex tape or fabric tape to the grommet, all the way up here to the branches. So we have the one injector set, and then over here we have the second injector set with additional clips. So I'm gonna still try and find another one. And then from there we have the CAS intake temp. I'm guessing that's knock or something else, and ground. So that's it. Harness is done. Now I need to find time to put it in. So it's looking good. All right. Now that the harness is all done, it's time to throw it back in the car. This is normally easier with 2 people. So pretty straightforward. There's just a hole here that goes through the firewall and through all the insulation. So I'm just trying to feed it through without catching any of the connectors. So I zip tied it. So ideally you'd want to have one person on the inside wiggling it so it doesn't get caught on anything. Last thing you want to do is cut the harness or cause some sort of an issue. All right, perfect. So this is all that's left, which is not a whole lot out here, but the tricky part is going to be this grommet. So I need to squish it on all 4 corners and then somehow wiggle it into the firewall. Oh, did I get it? I think I got it. Okay, so hopefully it shows up here. So right up here, there's the connection that is on the main harness. So that goes down here to the harness, and then the harness goes down here to the factory mounting tab and the other mounting tab. I think it's just over here. So this was just floating around. I don't know what that was. So I drilled a hole and I just mounted it. This was loose, and this is all steel, so that's good for grounding. Now, this one here is the additional grounds on the harness, and this is the factory ground on the harness. So this was actually loose, so I'm not sure how good it was grounding prior. And then these 2 connections for the harness here, that will go into the adapter that goes into the power commander. So it's all good under here. Now we can tidy it up and put the carpet back. So here I'm just reinstalling the harness itself. So once I end up finishing with the portion just inside and under the dash, I'm trying to find out exactly which way it would lay best to not cause any kinks or any strain or damage to the harness itself. So it took a little bit of effort and a little bit of using my brain to figure out exactly how we're going to get it to lay. Now the connectors themselves, being newer quick connectors, they're larger than the factory connectors, so I need to orient them in a way that it wouldn't end up running into clearance issues with the upper intake manifold. So I ended up finding one way where it would clip onto each injector and then turn the injector or rotate it out of the way so that the intake manifold would actually clear and not cause any bindings or chafing. Next, we're going to start by working on the grounds for the engine itself. Now, grounding these engines is very important so that it runs properly and that it doesn't cause any misfires or any issues down the road. So it was pretty easy to make these grounds. I found some 8 gauge or maybe 10 gauge wiring and some ring terminals. So all I did was measure it, cut it accordingly, and ended up crimping them, and then with a heat gun just to shrink the shrink tube portion. They looked factory and they're going to work perfectly well. I know what you're going to say, there's a million grounds going up and all over the place, but I've learned from my experience and in the past that the more the merrier. So just make sure that all the grounds are where they need to be, everything's grounded to one point, and then from that point over to the strut tower or to the chassis. Just to go over what I did really quickly, you can end up seeing up and through here, all of this brown wire is what I was showing you. So this is going to be all the additional or all the extra grounds here. So if you can't tell, obviously RX-7s have issues, and I wasn't playing any games. So the fuel rail, there's 2 grounds here, one to the center housing, one to the front housing, to the rear, to the bell housing, and then there's going to be one that goes from here to the strut tower, and from the strut tower to the negative on the battery. That's what we're working with. The injectors were a little bit close here. So as you can see, the connector here, this is actually larger than the factory one. So same for this one here. And these other ones, I didn't want any tension to be on there, but this is quite literally how it fits. So somehow I managed to luck out, and there's not even a mil of difference. Should be relatively straightforward. I've already test fit this. I've already test fit the intake manifold, so it does fit well enough. One issue that I'm having is that, what is that? I think that's so that sensor right there, this one, there used to be a little cap with a wire that clipped onto the end of it. I think that's the pressure sensor. I've looked up and around all through here in the harness and everything. I can't find it. So hopefully I don't need it, maybe, yeah. All right, so time to get the intake manifold sorted. So this one here I've had for some time now, and don't lose that gasket. So I've had it for some time now. It's being gasket matched, so port matched to the gasket itself. This is all being opened up just a little bit, just so it matches the diameter of this, so that it's relatively free flowing. And this here is where the witchcraft happens. So there's 2 sets of butterflies on this, and as you can see, it was JB welded. So this one had the secondary butterflies removed. So all of that unnecessary linkage was taken out, and this was welded, and of course on top I've painted it. And inside, let's see if I can get a light. So just inside there, you can actually see that the channels for the 3 little throttle bodies, it's been knife edged. I hope that's focusing. I don't really think it is, but I'm gonna try my best. So that's being knife edged, secondary butterflies were removed, and that's essentially all you really need to do to a T2 intake manifold. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bolt this to this, chuck it on that, and continue. So after you rifle through your box of Mazda parts, you come across your $40 gasket. Now, I wish I was joking, but I'm not. Now it goes without saying, when you take this tape off, don't drop anything into the lower intake manifold because you're not going to get it back. Looks like I got the majority of the tape. So next up, hold your rag where it's not gonna fall apart. Brake clean. And just wipe the surface of the intake manifold. Now I had already done this prior, but what I'm trying to do is get rid of any potential residue from the tape, only because I've dragged my backside, let this take more years than needed. So middle bolt is the long one. Yeah, okay, perfect. Open this without destroying the gasket. Careful. So this one's just like a thick paper gasket, essentially. Trust me, I'd reuse my old one if it wasn't oil saturated and completely destroyed. So that's nice. And then we mate the 2 in heavenly matrimony. And then what I typically do is I'll just put the center one in for now. So I'll snug it down. With my luck, I'm gonna end up needing to take it off again because I probably forgot something like I always do. So for the bolt down the middle and the nuts on the sides, I'm sure there's a specific torque process or torque value that you're supposed to be torquing these to, but what I ended up doing is the same as a lug nut. You alternate them until they're snug. It's a pretty thick gasket, so you don't need to worry about any imperfections. And then finally just tighten down the bolt right in the middle that ends up holding it right down the center. Ta-da! This millionaire piece here is the throttle position sensor. Don't lose it, don't break it, don't damage it. You're gonna cry. It's awful and impossible to get. If I was smart, I would have put this on before I put the intake manifold on, but here we are. So this one here is an FD intake temp sensor. Now, I believe the reason for that is the Power FC. Because the FD Power FC works off FD sensors, that's why I needed to run an FD map sensor and an FD intake manifold sensor. The filter is going to be changed. That goes without saying. Like, the filter is easily 13, 14 years old kind of deal. The spark plugs themselves, because the car hasn't run in some time, the spark plugs are still okay. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the cold start, and because it hasn't run in so long, if the spark plugs are going to foul, I'd rather the old plugs foul before I throw in some new ones, because these are not cheap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that the spark plugs are clean, snug, and then start by reassembling everything else here, including the ignition. All right, so small update. Off camera, what I ended up doing is I cleaned up the wiring up and around here. So as you can see, the wiring up and through here, this is nothing crazy. I'm sure a lot of you have seen something much, much cleaner, but this is significantly cleaner than it was. So this is all kind of pushed to the side where the intercooler pipe goes. This is all nice and tucked away now. These are the power wires that connect to the battery. 2 for the horn and then 1 for the MSD box here. And then from there, this is all nice, no tension, no nothing. I put a stud on there, so this will be nice and tight. And then moving up and around here, I put another grounding point. So this here, the way it's sitting, normally it's on these 3 posts. But because the intercooler piping runs right through here, this one needed to be relocated. So I just wanted to make sure that I grounded it properly and right to the strut tower. So I ensured there's continuity, should be good. So realistically, now it's time to fit the intercooler piping and something like that. Anyways, that's where we're gonna start off next. Anyways, I think that's gonna be all for today. Next, I'm gonna grind away. Hopefully within a weekend, I can get it up, finished, and driving. So that'd be nice. Anyways, feel free to like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next one. Some kid's getting yelled at by his mom. No, kid, you're not gonna grow up to be dumb and work on an RX-7. I refuse to allow this.